Thank you, Suzanne. I don't need an applause. Thanks, everyone, and thank you all so much for coming, braving the weather in Melbourne tonight. It's fantastic to see so many of you here coming to listening to young people talk to young people, which is something we've been pushing for a lot at La Trobe. So a big thank you to the Alumni Office especially for basically helping out and to organise tonight. I'd like to introduce the panel who's sitting on stage. First to my left is Tom Cowie. Tom graduated from a Bachelor of Journalism at La Trobe University in 2009 and went on to actually land his first job via social media through a campaign called Tom Wants a Job. This is when Twitter had just started to sort of become relevant to the industry, and Tom was one of the first people to actually use it very relevantly for the purposes of getting a job at Crikey. He then went on to work at the Ballarat Courier for the Fairfax Media Group and is now back working at the Age newspaper in Melbourne. Jess Gregory brings a very unique perspective tonight because she actually works on the other side of the fence in policy and communications. She's currently with Domestic Violence Victoria, has worked as a journalist and also in communications and PR as well across multiple cities, has moved back to Melbourne over the past 2 years, which her parents are very happy about, I hear. And yes, she's the daughter of Peter Gregory, if anyone hasn't made the connection, for the students who are in the audience. So it's Peter's one of the tutors at La Trobe, lecturers. He's in the audience, but I won't point to him because has distinctive features anyway. And Mark Di Stefano, who's the political editor of BuzzFeed, he started working for the ABC, also landed his BuzzFeed job through social media, is a prolific tweeter, and I was happy that he tweeted today saying that he's arrived in Melbourne because that meant, yes, he's here. All is underway. And he's most recently written a book called What a Time to Be Alive, which is a campaign diary of one of the longest elections in history, the 2016 election, which produced one of the most exciting results. And we're continuing to observe that in Parliament every day, just as we were going to air tonight, if you like. Pauline Anson delivered a speech, and we'll be talking a little bit about that as well. So the format of the evening will be that Mark will first give us an address as our keynote speaker at the lectern, and then he'll come back and join the panel. Then I'll have some questions for everybody, and then you'll have an opportunity at the end to ask questions as well. So, starting with Mark Di Stefano, please put your hands together for our panel tonight, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm just going to open, I'm not tweeting, I promise. I'm just going to open this up so I keep to time so we can get as much panel talk and questions as possible. I just want to say firstly, thank you so much, Erdem, for the invitation, and to La Trobe University. It is these sort of events are just buzzing for me because I love talking to other young journos who are mostly freaking out about their futures, because I was you guys once, and by once, like it was a couple of years ago, that I genuinely thought that I was never going to become a journalist. I had just failed to get a cadetship at the ABC for the third time. I had been knocked back from a cadetship at Fairfax twice. My writing was crap. My voice, I was told by the ABC that my voice was too feminine, which was very funny. And they said, yeah, I'd never work in radio. And then a couple of years later, I ended up as a newsreader on Triple J's. My story as a journalist starts... I went to the University of Sydney, did a degree, got through uni. That was, and being the editor of the student paper on Histoire was like a massive part of me developing into someone who actually can report. And the thing then I learned, which I use every day, that I know that the people up on stage would probably can echo, is that the person who has the least shame and the person who makes the most phone calls is the best reporter. And I've taken that through to my reporting at BuzzFeed. We get knocked all the time, get sledged all the time about being cats or clickbait or Kardashians. It can sometimes be dispiriting, but I will maintain that our reporting is some of the strongest, most aggressive reporting on the internet because we still make the phone calls, we still do the interviews, and we still jostle to make sure that we're at the front line of the press conference. So tonight, I've been asked to sort of reflect on the election and talk about social media. So where I wanted to start was start with actually a bit of an interesting proposition, which is social media actually didn't have that big of an impact on the election. Not as big as past elections, because both the Labor and Liberal Party and the coalition, they're moving away from social media, whether it's Facebook and Twitter, and trying to move way more towards real life organising, because they're starting to realise there's a limitation to social media, and we can talk about this later. When it comes to, I actually thought before this election started, the 8-week campaign started, I thought that this election would be the live streaming election. Facebook Live had just launched. Periscope has been around a couple of years, but it's a bit of a crappy product. But I thought to myself, oh look, everyone's going to be Facebook Living. Everyone's going to be doing live events and all that sort of stuff. And every time I showed up at a Labor press conference, there would be someone from Labor with an iPhone on the side and horizontal, and their job would be to live stream a Bill Shorten press conference. And if anyone's watched a Bill Shorten press conference, they're not exactly the most entertaining things in the world. And it was not really being shared a lot on Facebook. It wasn't really getting a lot of views. So I was a little bit dejected when I realised that actually this was not the Facebook Live election. We did have a debate that was taking part all on Facebook Live, but it was put at 6:30 on a Friday night, which genuinely, if you wanted as little people to watch as possible, you would put it at 6:30 on a Friday night. I think Geelong was playing the Crows that night, and there was a whole bunch of rugby league games on, and Eurovision semi-finals on that night as well. But there was a video that Labor did on Facebook. It was Bill Shorten and Cowie Shorten. And Cowie Shorten was interviewing Bill Shorten about his life, and they were in a pub. And it was this 4-minute video that the Labor Herald had done. And I reckon they thought it was great. They were like, this is great content. But it was awful. No one liked it. No one viewed it. No one shared it. And again, it was it's an experiment, and I'm actually really glad that Labor do this. But it was amazing. It was another lesson that the Labor Herald, which is if people don't know, Labor started a sort of in-house content machine. They sort of marketed it as their own little, their own BuzzFeed for Labor. It's a good sign that people see through that, and as seeing through the fact that Labor content for Labor content for an audience isn't nearly as exciting as BuzzFeed content for an audience, or The Age content for an audience, or whatever it is. So that failed. So there's a couple of little failures there. On the Liberal side, I want to tell you just a quick anecdote. Tony Nutt was the Liberal Party director. Big man, bald head, sort of beady eyes. He looks like a Harry Potter character. And Tony Nutt, he said thank you to all of his staff at the end of the election campaign, and he said, thank you to the on-the-ground team, you've been amazing. Thank you to the backroom staff, you've been great, blah blah blah. And he said thank you everyone. And someone came up to him and he said, and he's like, oh, sorry, yeah, thank you to the digital team, whatever it is you do. And I was like, I wasn't there, but I got told this story. I was like, this is 2016. And this guy is supposed to be running, a federal election campaign. A, the digital campaign wasn't front and centre. And B, he didn't actually know what was going on. He didn't know even what they did. And I think that anecdote was a real telling thing for me, where I started to realise that actually the Liberal Party and the coalition didn't put a lot of stress and didn't put a lot of focus on the election. The one piece of content that the coalition everyone was losing it over was Malcolm Turnbull's video of his father. And it was a video, it was 90 seconds, and it was Malcolm Turnbull was talking about how great his father is and as an influence on his life. And we did that thing, the media did that thing which a few people called juicing, where a video goes out created by Malcolm Turnbull, and then the media don't ask any questions and then turn that video into a piece of news. And I call it juicing because it's literally taking something and squashing it and taking the good bits out and writing some paragraphs around it. It is maybe the one thing that is destroying journalism more than anything, which is juicing without adding anything to it. Another example recently was Mike Baird, the New South... Oh, actually, better example, I'm in Victoria. Daniel Andrews does this all the time. He'll upload like a really like viral Facebook status about like LGBT families or something. And like The Age and BuzzFeed and a whole bunch, we will be forced to write about his Facebook status. And so actually what we're doing is in 2016, we're rewriting a media release or a press release and putting it up on our websites. And it's a big problem, and we need to do better. Malcolm Turnbull checks his Twitter all day, but he doesn't tweet for himself anymore, which is like really devastating because he was so good and now he's so bad. I was drunk about 3 weeks ago. Friday night, I was out with my mates, and I've got notifications for when Malcolm Turnbull uploads his Facebook, because I'm a sad person. I was drunk with mates, and it was like, Malcolm Turnbull has added a new video. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. So I like checked it in the toilets, because again, that's what I do. So I looked at it, and it was a Twitter link, and I was like, what? And no shit, the Prime Minister of Australia's social media team had copy and pasted a Twitter link and uploaded that to Facebook, thinking that's how things were done. And you know, there's a joke on the internet, you know, where is so-and-so's social media manager? I was like, where is the Prime Minister's social media manager? The Prime Minister's social media manager is rubbish. And his social media team are rubbish. And I'm fine with saying that because like, and I know who they are. Like, they just don't know what they're doing. And it's amazing in 2016 that we have this situation. The way that I use Twitter, obviously I use it as like a notebook. So if I'm watching Pauline Hanson's maiden speech, I'm live tweeting quotes and then being able to use those quotes later. So that's like one way to use it. But the way that I like to tell people about how I use it is like, you're telling short stories contained in a tweet that you can then turn into a larger story, and you should listen to Twitter and it can tell you some things about something. So for example, I got sent a table which just showed like negative gearing, what electorates actually benefited most from negative gearing. Obviously like Wentworth was number one, you know, Malcolm Turnbull's, like Josh Frydenberg's was number two. And I literally just put it on Twitter and it was like, these are the electorates that are benefiting the most from a negative gearing. It went berserk. You know, within about 20 minutes, it had 200 retweets. So that tells me as a journalist that there's some heat in the subject. There's some heat there in that tweet. So all we did was I then took that data, I put a headline up, I put the table in a story, I interviewed a couple of people who are experts, and within about an hour, we had a story up on our website that we could actually then take across onto Facebook, and it went super viral, and it went, it got huge amounts of readers. The way you can use Twitter is actually by listening to a community of people that are essentially upvoting and downvoting a potential headline, if that makes sense. And that's the way I think Twitter will remain powerful for journalists. It's not just to impress people and to get in front of people and run campaigns to get jobs, even though that was great, and I sort of did the same thing. There's just two more things I want to talk about before I end this sort of short little spiel. We're in this moment, this anti-establishment moment that's in Australia probably best symbolised by Pauline Hanson, but it's best symbolised by Jeremy Corbyn in the UK and Brexit in the UK, and best symbolised by Donald Trump in the US. And the lesson that we have to learn as journalists in the media is the fact that they don't need the media. They don't need journalists. They don't need newspapers. They don't need websites. What they need is just a Facebook page, and what they need is just a Twitter account. An example I would just say is like Jeremy Corbyn staged this bizarre train protest a couple of weeks ago, if people saw. He was like, couldn't find a seat on the train, so he like sat down on the floor and then like uploaded to Facebook that like, classic privatisation of the Virgin trains, and he made a political point about it. Well, some journalists fact-checked it, and it turned out there were seats on the train. and he looked like an absolute prat. Jeremy Corbyn doesn't need The Sun, he doesn't need The Times, he doesn't need The Guardian. It actually is beneficial to him and his audience if those places hit him. In the same way that it's beneficial to Pauline Hanson if The Guardian, the Sydney Morning Herald, the BuzzFeeds, the Crikey, if we all gang up on Pauline Hanson, her support base hardens. And so what we need to do as journalists in this age of juicing, in this age of political leaders bypassing journalists and speaking directly to audiences, we need to find a way to make ourselves relevant. And the best way to do that is to fact check rigorously and aggressively, and to push back and to ask hard questions. And I was saying this to Erdem before. Think about this, and it's I shouldn't swear, but it's bloody terrifying, right? Is probably there's about 20 to 30 new journalism jobs in Australia every year. 20 to 30, right? I wish every day, right? But there's about 20 to 30 new ones every year. I think that the graduate class of La Trobe is like 110. Sydney Uni is like 100. UTS, CSU, Bond University. So if we are, as journalists, coming up against a situation where there's a shrinking pool of vacancies, what you need to do as young journalists is to find a way to make yourself stand out and be different in a sea of mediocrity. And I know that sounds harsh, but like the reason why Tom Cowie got his job at Crikey was because he wasn't mediocre. The reason why I got my job at BuzzFeed is because I live tweeted Northern Territory estimates. And I was tweeting about the Palmerston Road Hospital. And my boss thought that was hilarious. And I was getting tweets about the Northern Territory trending around Australia. If we're going to be coming up against Pauline Hanson and Corbyn and Trump and even the Bill Shorten, Chloe Shorten video, what journalists need to do is innovate and disrupt and go as aggressively as possible, and give readers what they want, and make sure that the audience knows that a journalist is out there not to keep access, not to keep friends with the Prime Minister's staffers, but the journalist is there as a voice and an ear for the audience out in the public. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
15 minutes, 15 seconds. So it's 15
Fantastic.
seconds over.
One of the benefits of the iPhone. All right, so I just want to start by picking up on a couple of themes that Mark mentioned there and throw it open to the panel as well. Let's start with the whole juicing story, and Tom, I'm going to come to you on this, of what Mark labelled as juicing. How much of that is a daily reality for a reporter at The Age?
Well, I think Mark's definition of juicing, which is rewriting press releases, to be honest, that is a pretty regular thing. I work in crime reporter, and so a lot of our stuff comes from Victoria Police, and they put out media releases where they will say, someone carjacked at Chadstone Shopping Centre last night. That was one today. That kind of story, you kind of have to write it up straight away. You have to, that news, they've broken that news. Unfortunately, that's the way they do it now. But we have to write that up straight away. You want to dive in deeper, if you can, and try and find out exactly what happened. But the current reality of it is the flood comes out and you have to try and keep up. I think what I think is probably a more insidious form is taking other people's stories.
Yeah, that's another form.
Sorry. Which we refer to as churning, when you churn someone else's story. And sometimes you just get beaten. And for example, the Herald Sun's our biggest competitor, and sometimes the Herald Sun beats us, sometimes we beat them. And sometimes you've got to rewrite their story, but you do attribute. You just say the Herald Sun reports. You would like to get on your own if you can, but it's not always the reality. There are some places, some outlets that don't always attribute, and they'll just steal other people's stories. I think the initials of an outlet will be DM, an English outlet that have come here. They will attribute, but they will steal every story that is any good on any website, particularly the major outlets. And that is a real problem. I think that's, that needs to stop.
Mark, do you agree with that?
Yeah. So journalism, churning. There's 3 versions of juicing that I talk about. It's there's rewriting press releases, which is kind of okay in many ways, because you're rewriting a police media thing that is actually genuinely public interest. That's fine. The other one is when people are literally, and you guys will see it all the time, if you start getting you start looking for how a news outlet got the story, because most news outlets want to show off that it's an exclusive. If they're not showing it off in the first couple of paragraphs, it means because they've taken it from somewhere else, or they've taken it from someone else. The one that I hate at the moment is someone rewrites your story, and then right at the bottom is either a link to your story, but no one's getting to the bottom. No one's being via BuzzFeed. It's via BuzzFeed, put that in the freaking first line. That's my story. And then the other third one is Julia Gillard uploads a Instagram of her looking cute for her birthday. And it's Throwback Thursday, #TBT. So what we do, and this is really bad, but we do it, and everyone does it, is you copy and paste it into your CMS, your content management system. You write, Julia Gillard just slayed Throwback Thursday, and then you come up with 4 paragraphs, and you've got a story. You didn't call anyone, you didn't do any journalism, but because it's going viral somewhere else, you need it for your website. And that's just the daily reality of it.
I was Jess, you're going to jump in there, I apologise.
Yeah, I feel like there can be some really big legal implications as well when you rewrite a story and then add in some details. So you saw that fairly recently in New South Wales, where a journalist got into a fair bit of trouble in Victoria because she rewrote a court story, added in some details that weren't disclosed in the case, and that ended up throwing out the jury in the case, and she was brought before the judge. So rewriting stories, it's a part of everyday practice, but I think it's something to be careful about and be aware of.
In Mark's address, he spoke about how the Trumps and the Hansons of the world are using, they don't need journalists. They have their supporter base and they speak directly to them via social media. Jess, you do this on a day-to-day basis. You have a supporter base or an audience or an interest group, if you like, through your work at Domestic Violence Victoria. How do you use social media to engage with that group of individuals, particularly when we're talking about important social issues like domestic violence?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of ways that we do it. So there's our key supporter base, and I guess that's a way of demonstrating our work and also responding. So for Domestic Violence Victoria, about 4 or 5 years ago, we didn't have a strong social media presence, and that was something that when I worked there a few years ago, and I went to a research, that's a long story. So I helped set up some of those accounts. And around the time of the Royal Commission, where all of a sudden, we're a really small team, we've got 4 or 5 people, we were having to respond to things all the time, press releases from ministers and announcements of new policies. Having something like social media is a really good way of being able to respond quickly, being able to engage. I promised my dad I would not use the word engage tonight, so I'm going to try very hard. Stakeholders, engagement. How many more buzzwords can I... to be able to talk to journalists, academics, ambassadors, have really good discussions about what that means. I think we don't necessarily use social media with the purpose of speaking to our direct followers. We use it knowing that our content will be shared, that we will be able to respond to something, and then that will go broader. Also, we work on really tight budgets, so the way we work is pretty lean. If we can respond and we can use that tool, then that's great. But we don't have massive resources to sit with. We don't have a social media manager. So the way we do it is pretty strategic, I'd say. As
opposed to BuzzFeed and The Age, which are rolling around in cash, I hear.
Yeah. Oh my God. We have so much money. I would just say to that, there's that thing of Twitter is, for me and for a lot of people, is about signal. So it's about signalling to other journalists in the media and stakeholders, politicians, specialists, what stories you've got. It's about showing off. No traffic's coming through Twitter. Your readers aren't coming through there. Your readers are coming through your website, or they're coming through Facebook. So what we try to do, and I try to tell all our young reporters, is that use Twitter as this is what I want to tell everyone what I'm working on, and all the other journalists what I've got. And I think that with organisations, the best organisations get really out in front of journalists on Twitter, say, potentially, and then journalists are always looking for stories. They're like, oh, I saw that tweet from Domestic Violence Victoria. I could do a story on that, whatever it is.
Well, and I think that's when you talk about heat, you know, and being able to generate. That's a really good way of, say, a small organisation being able to say, people are interested in this, they're sharing this. And when I worked at ANROS, a research organisation, we had a conference, and I had a chat with a few journos who write regularly on violence against women in the lead-up. And they were sort of saying, look, there's no new, you know, there's not really much news in this because we don't have a new report or we don't have a new something to share. But we had a really strong Twitter following at the conference, and some of the topics that people were talking about on the day were being shared and discussed broader than the attendees at the conference. So it only took half a day, and I was getting phone calls from radio producers saying, this conference is great, can we get some people, you know, and we set up some interviews. And so in that way, we were leading the story. You know, we had the conversations ahead, but having that Twitter presence made a big difference.
So I do want to talk about the limitation of social media that Mark mentioned in his speech. But before we get to that, everyone's wondering, Tom wants a job. What was that about, man?
It can't be a Trobe event without being called up. So Tom wants a job was a social media campaign that I started when I was at uni in my last semester. And I, like everyone, you know, student sitting here, was wondering how I was going to get a job. It wasn't as bad as it is now, but it was still bad. Not a lot of work out there. And I sort of was thinking what Mark was saying before, you had to stand out. You had to do something that was different. You couldn't just keep on lobbing in job applications, because the chances are you're not going to get one, no matter how good you are. And that was the experience of a lot of my fellow students. So I started a blog. It's still up. I've left it up despite the embarrassment it causes me sometimes. And Tom Wants a Job blog on WordPress, and just essentially just wrote about what it was like trying to get a job. You know, I asked my followers what I should apply for. I think there was one for a sub-editor position at Zoo magazine. There was those kinds of things. I was on Twitter kind of talking about it and talking to journalists, saying, can you retweet me? Can you give me, you know, can you sort of give me advice and that kind of thing? And yeah, it worked. After about 3 weeks, it got picked up.
Can I just add to that? I think the number one question you get asked, I don't know about you guys, but like the number one question I get asked by young people who are in journalism schools or whatever is like, how do I get a job? Like, genuinely, it's the number one. It's probably some of the reasons why people are here tonight is like they're trying to figure it out. Again, like I've freaked out for years about it because we got to the end of my 4-year degree and they were like, last lecture, she's like, any more questions? And then everyone shot their hand up, was like, you haven't taught us how do we getting a job? Like, it's like that was the number one anxiety. And I would just say with setting up a WordPress and blog and all that sort of stuff, like, I don't want to be disparaging, but that's like a very 2008, 2009 thing. You only need a Twitter account now, like genuinely. People don't read blogs. Like blogs are too long now. And the number one thing that journalists love doing, older journalists, I learnt this as well, it's probably what Tom realised, is older journalists love helping young journalists. So if you have any like, hey, can you help me out with so-and-so, and you literally just like tweet at Annabelle Crabb or like George Megalogenis, or like someone like super, like you'll be surprised at how willing they are to help you out. I asked Annabelle Crabb for an interview for my student paper, and she invited me over for like tea and coffee, like tea and a cake. Like it was like my own version of kitchen cabinet. It was amazing. And I sat there, and like she had like kids running around, and like I sat there, and I was like, and we had a 3-hour conversation, and I just think that like if you are anxious about this sort of stuff, like, get yourself out there and just start asking around, because actually that's kind of the skill of a reporter as well, is actually asking questions when it's a bit awkward.
Yeah, persistence as well. That it sort of shows that if you're willing to do the extra thing, go to the extra step.
Like, don't be a pest, but like,
no,
yeah.
You've got to show some tact. But you're right. That older journalists want to help younger journalists because we want more journalists to help us tell stories. I think sort of if you talk to anyone in the Age newsroom about wanting more reporters in there, they would say, 100 times yes, because we are under this increasing load where we can't tell the stories, all of them that we want to tell. And if we had more reporters, we could spread the load.
Can I just add one more story, Erdem? I'm sorry. But it's like a good friend of mine, Paul Karp, he now writes for The Guardian, And Karp, similar. So smart, great young journalist. But he got a job working for I think it's the Reuters subscription service in industrial relations. And it was a subscription service, so 1,000 people read it. And he was writing about hardcore IR stories that no one read, but the people that read it really cared. And Karp had a Twitter account, and he just started live tweeting the Royal Commission into the trade unions. And so was giving away all of this amazing insight. And I think it was in 2 months into live tweeting, he ended up being interviewed by Mark Colvin on PM. And then eventually, because he got all these followers, journalists who were I don't want to watch all of the Royal Commission, but there's a young journalist there that can explain it really well. He eventually he applied for a job in the press gallery with Lenore Taylor. It was just yeah, you're amazing. And that's how he got his job. So if someone goes along to a thing and just live tweets it, it shows talent. Talent comes through. And being able to do that is just, an amazing thing about our age. We have phones, we have platforms that are completely free. So if you're just stuffing around for a couple of hours, live tweet Q&A, live tweet question time. That shows skill if it cuts through.
So if young people have this, why doesn't Malcolm Turnbull?
Well, Malcolm Turnbull genuinely got told when he came in as Prime Minister, no more tweeting. It was you need to focus on real world things. And I don't know if it was Arthur, but I don't know if it was Arthur Sinodinos or because I think it was Sinodinos. I think it was someone who was just got in his ear about don't stuff around with things that don't matter. And so there was a snobbishness around social media. He just hasn't, bizarrely, reached out to Mike Baird's social media manager or Daniel Andrews' social media manager and just poached them. I find it baffling that they just haven't done that. The people that are working on it now, on his social media accounts, they don't like social media. They actually don't like it. And if you don't like it and you're doing it every day, it's it comes through. So again, it's look at the way that Corbyn uses social media, the way that Obama's social media people use it. It's one of those things. You've got to have someone dedicated to doing it, and you've got to have someone who's willing to go through the comments and like everything, and get in contact with people. And I'm sure this is part of your job. It's every little bit of effort that you do tending to your followers, it gets repaid back massively.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's I find it hard with politicians because I think when they have a great social media presence, it's really evident and, it makes them definitely more likeable. And there is that challenge about, well, is that the future of politics? Is that putting that kind of resources? Because they have their own social media manager. That's all money that they're spending on great content, which is great for us to read and engage with. How much of that is helping us hold them accountable?
Oh, and I'd argue it's simply less accountable in terms of journalistic rigour, but it's if you want to get your message out in a way. So if Daniel Andrews has just extended the Safe Schools program and he uploads a letter that he wrote to Malcolm Turnbull saying "stuff you," and that gets 10,000 shares. I mean, that does nothing. It does a lot to actually entrench his reputation amongst the LGBT community, but does it do much to tell the full story? No, it doesn't, because Daniel Andrews is trying to wedge the Prime Minister. So what you need a journalist at The Age to come in and provide the narrative around it as well. And I think that I've only seen Daniel Andrews' great social media from a distance, so I don't really know it. But he really does. Daniel Andrews does seem like someone who is market leader when it comes to social media.
I find the difference between his social media account and then the coverage he's getting at the moment in the two major papers really interesting. You've got this the CFA, EBA union fight just going on, and he's copping heat from everywhere. Ministers resigning. You would think that he's in this political turmoil, but then you look on Facebook, where a lot of people, that's where they get their news from. That's all they use for news, and they have liked Daniel Andrews at some point, and Daniel Andrews is talking up his achievements about same-sex marriage or
refugees. He was really big on.
Well, a lot of federal issues as well, which he has no real power over. But then also, level crossings, infrastructure, all these kinds of things. And he's getting heaps of likes, lots of comments in there saying, "You're the best Premier. A lot of people from outside Victoria saying, I wish you were our Premier, all this kind of thing. I find it really fascinating.
And if anything, it's the one curse, like it's a great thesis topic, right? Like the fact is, Daniel Andrews is getting absolutely slammed for his treatment of the CFA issue down here. I think it was the Age did a story a couple of weeks ago about his comments about someone who had cancer. It was like really awkward. Anyway, that story, it didn't get to me, and I'm a massive politics nerd. But it would have got to people who read the Age. It would have got to less people who would have watched a great video of Daniel Andrews marching in a Mardi Gras parade. You know what I mean? And this is the whole thing about journalists have to create a space for themselves to make sure that we don't become extinct. Like, we actually have to keep them accountable and our industry accountable, because we're going to become extinct if we don't.
But of course, the argument that politicians make, and Lindsay Tanner did this in his book Sideshow a few years ago, is that it's the 24-hour news cycle, it's social media that is dumbing down our democracy and dumbing
That's
down
total
politics.
bullshit. And people who
I knew you'd say that.
people who say that are just bad politicians. Like, good politicians just know how to work the social media cycle and the media cycle at the same time. For all Bill Shorten's faults, like, he's got a good social media team behind him, but he gets the news cycle. He's a good he's an amazing process politician. The way that the Labor opposition has operated in the first couple of weeks of Parliament shows that he's a great politician. And he's getting destroyed by the Daily Telegraph, but then they swept Western Sydney. So it's like, I just think that people who want to blame the 24-hour media cycle, it's just like, well, you can destroy it. Like, you can actually just bypass us all, and you can do better if you want. So,
Jess, is that a view you subscribe to?
That's a good question. No, well, I think it's now their responsibility. You know, I think it's there might be a 24-hour news cycle, but you've got to subscribe to it. You're a politician. It's your job.
And it's also like the audience want it. Like, people out there want something new every couple of hours. Doesn't mean you have to fight every fight, but if you're starting to lose, I always think that, like, the current federal political system that we've got now, like, ground zero for our complete brokenness of a system is like 2010 when Gillard knifed Rudd. Everything that has happened since then, the 6 years of like turmoil, just always goes, and the churn goes back to then. Goes back to like some Labor Party bedwetters who decided to get rid of Rudd in his first term. If we didn't have that moment in our Australian political history, we would not have Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister. We may not have had Tony Abbott as Prime Minister. I don't know. History revisionism is dumb, but I just think that, like, people who complain about 24/7 news coverage is just like, Angela Merkel has been in power for ages. Like, are you trying to tell me that, like, she doesn't know how to, like, be a good politician and master the 24-hour cycle? There are great politicians out there that are killing it.
Tom, you've observed federal politics, obviously, for a very long time. You've reported on state politics at The Age as well. How much of your coverage, and also in crime as well, is about what the audience wants versus what is actually a story?
Oh, the million-dollar question. It's much more about what the audience wants now than it used to be. There's definitely a conflict going on in media, and this is why places like BuzzFeed have kind of come along and said, well, we want to give the audience what they want. That's what they want. And mixed in with, obviously, you know, trying to tell stories that are important. I think The Age is still kind of grappling with that legacy issue of this is telling the audience, you know, you should care about this. This is what we think you should care about. Now we're getting to the point that, well, people aren't reading those stories. You know, we put them, if they're not engaging and not interesting and they're not told in a really, a creative way with a nice, picture and it's just going to die online and no one's going to read it. We get all our numbers now. And we can look at it at the end of the week, or when we can look at it live and see how it's going. And if it's tanking, you don't want to be writing a story that no one's reading. You want to write stories that people read, but you also want to try and cross that breach between important story that people really care about. That's like the kind of golden moment. If you can find that sweet spot, then you're laughing.
Can I ask? So, what are the kind of stories that tank? That's just my curiosity.
Well, I mean, we do. There are certain things that just don't do well. If you have them in a headline on the homepage, And we have this thing called Chartbeat now, which is essentially has a number next to it, and it's either red or green. And if that number is high and it's green, then it's doing well. If it's red and really, it's like 15, then it's not doing that well. And there are certain words that if you put them in a headline, they will just, people, and like things like climate change, refugees, these are the readers that don't, people say, oh, we want to read more stories about refugees or whatever, why don't you report these issues anymore? Well, we still report them, but we're trying to find ways to make you read them. So we have to kind of be creative about how we sell a story.
I think that the one for BuzzFeed, our audience might be a bit different, but I kind of feel as though that there's a lot of Venn diagram, is that the short, punchy story that's like breaking news, that'll do really well. Like breaking news, it's happening, it's the story everyone's talking about, get it out, it's, you don't need to do too much, Turnbull said something, or whatever it is. The second story that does super well is like the scoop, the exclusive. Like literally the story that no one you can't read anywhere else. So like, we published a story about George Barandis's giving a job to his son's lawyer last week, and like, that's boring in many ways, but it went berserk online because people were outraged and they couldn't read it anywhere else. So the exclusive, and then things that are long go so well. So if you write something that's really long, like a 5,000 word piece, but it's well researched, it's good journalism, it's going to go really well online. We think about there's like a valley of death length. It's like between say 500 words and 2,000 words. And it's kind of just a story that by about halfway you're just like, I'm not reading the rest. You just by about halfway you're like, I know exactly what this story is. And it's those stories that are process stories. It's like, so-and-so said this, so-and-so said this, here's a bit of context, so-and-so said this, so-and-so said this. It's like there's no conflict in the story. It's just like, all right, yeah. I've read the lead. I know exactly what the whole story is.
It's the classic inverted pyramid.
Yeah.
What we all learnt I don't know if they're still teaching, they probably are, at La Trobe. I learnt it, how to write, the most important paragraph, and then you slowly get down to the least important paragraph. Those stories, unless they are breaking or something really big, they will just disappear. And so you've got to find a new way to tell it. You've got to be creative with your lead par and essentially you're trying to get them to read to the bottom. Because we do get stats now that also, there's hard numbers, but there's also just time on the page. How long people have spent reading your story. And sometimes it's very disheartening. Yeah.
I think
30 seconds.
And I think that sometimes people like to know about this sort of stuff. Like BuzzFeed, we have a heat map on the site. It's we can see where people drop off. So by the end, we had a literal, I think it might be 16%. So literally only 16% of people got to the end. If it's a high number, 80%, we know that story is killing it because it's that engaging that it got people to the end. And you know what's across the bottom is that widget that says share with Facebook, Twitter, and email and Pinterest or whatever it is. Though if we get people to the end, it's more likely we're going to get someone to click on those buttons, which again is so much better for our stories.
So, Jess, how do organisations like yours keep what these guys are saying, not stories that necessarily get debate? Domestic violence, I think everyone in this room would agree, is a massive issue in Australia. How do you keep it relevant and on the agenda?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that pattern there because, so there's been a lot of work around reporting on violence against women because what we know is that the way media report on violence against women, and particularly family violence as an issue, affects how the broader public understand the social issue. And for a long time, the incidents where someone was killed as a result of family violence or pattern of crime, that pattern, seeing that pattern of similar characteristics in the type of crime wasn't necessarily picked up. So, we weren't necessarily identifying this is the number of women who've been killed in the same way this year, that kind of thing. So doing some work, so there's been some work in Victoria. It started in a very grassroots level about 15 years ago, but it was about community organisations kind of all talking together and saying, well, how do we explain this? How do we end up in these stories? How do we be the person that a journalist calls to talk about it? And part of it was developing some language and kind of being consistent about it so that you could answer that question. Someone calls you and says, I've got a file in 2 hours, tell me about this issue. That person who works for a small community organisation in Ballarat could answer it. So I think being able to be responsive, that changes the way that media can report too. It changes the type of story. So you might not just be running a story about a single incident. You then start talking about the pattern of violence against women as a crime, and the community start to say, oh wait, this is actually a huge issue. This is happening to a massive part of our population, and we're quite angry about it. And so that feeds the cycle. That means that, you know, things like a royal commissions, the Luke Batty inquest was just massive in terms of, but that created reasons to have news stories every day. I guess what that has meant for us in the long run is, and so my boss, Fiona McCormack, she's pretty synonymous with the issue of domestic violence. 5 or 6 years ago, she might have got a phone call a couple of times a year about a domestic violence story. She now gets asked to write opinion pieces. So she has more of an opportunity, and we as an organisation can talk about violence against women in a public sense more often, and that continues. So the more you can do that, it's a self-perpetuating thing.
And someone like Rosie Batty uses social media incredibly well, or her team uses it incredibly well for what is obviously a very sad story in her life. Just before we do open to the floor for questions, which we're about to do in a minute because we're keen to hear from you guys, I just want to touch on something it's a common theme in your book, Mark, and I know something that Tom and I have debated a lot, and that's what you leave off the record and what you put on the record. Yeah. So you say in your book that there's no clear definitions and that there are no blanket rules that are recognised and adhered to like in some journalism textbook.
There aren't, unfortunately. There are, and this is the problem, there aren't.
And you start off in your book by saying that unless someone's told you something is off the record, including a pub discussion, then you've assumed that it's on the record and you've used it in your book.
And for some people that's controversial, which is what's so funny. It's like, so there are two ways you can do it, right? Your approach can be everything is off the record until it's on. So we're having a private, like I'm talking to a politician, whatever, and then they say, and I say, oh, can I put that bit on the record? And then they say, oh yeah, you can put that bit on the record. Okay. Or you can have everything on the record until it's off. And that's how I operate, which is we're talking, someone slides into my direct messages and it's just like having a conversation with me. It's on the record. Until they say, hey, I want to tell you something, but this is off the record, I go, sure, tell me, it's off the record. And people like to think that like I've like burnt heaps of bridges. It's like I have not burnt one source in this whole book because they know that like I have a negotiation. Off the record is a negotiation between a source and a journalist. It's not an implied right. No one has a right to be off the record. But there's also a fairness aspect. So if someone mistakenly talks to you, there are ways to be fair about it. There's a story in the opening chapters where literally someone thought I was another journalist. So it was just chatty to me. And she was telling me stuff that was like really like a great story.
And she had her hand down her pants.
She had her hand in my pants, right? Which is another story. I mean, it was the same story. But
it was like drinks afterwards.
Yeah. But it's like, what she was telling me was like really quite, it was a good story. Anyway, I didn't identify her because that could potentially destroy her career.
But effectively, you're making the decision there, aren't you? Whether it's on or off the record. She didn't make that decision. You made that decision not to identify her.
Yeah, I did. But she's got to realise there's that, like, again, my audience is out there. Like, my audience isn't her. She's not my audience. I don't want to burn anyone. I don't want to be one of those people that like people don't want to talk to. If anything, this book has made people want to talk to me more, which is really weird, and like gossip more. I just think that you should operate with everything's on the record until you get asked, it's off. Because if you go to a press conference and like say you overhear a press secretary talking and a private conversation, but that directly contradicts what you're listening to on the microphone, should you not report what's happening over there and that you can hear? I just think you should be able to. Like, I think that that's your job as a journalist.
Tom, I'll give you the last say and then we'll open it up to the floor.
Look, yeah, I agree with Mark largely. In politics, I think that's a good way to operate because people know the rules and people, you know, media spinners as well as politicians know how it works. And they know if they're talking to a journalist, they've got to be careful if they don't want it to get out there.
But also, like, why talk to me? Like, you're talking to me for a reason. You want your message out in many ways, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I think if you're talking to, for example, in my day-to-day job, talking to police officers or victims of crime, or you kind of give them an opportunity sometimes. You say, look, I'm going to write a story about this. Can I name you? You kind of, because they don't know the game, the rules of how it works, you can't say, is this on or off the record, or just assume it's all on the record.
I agree. I totally agree with you in that, and I actually think that that's where ethics come into it. Like, so I've actually at one stage said, please stop talking. Like, stop talking, because what you're saying to me, I want to print, and so just stop and don't talk to other journalists about that, because that's a great story and it's going to destroy your career and whatever. And it's also, I mean, there's a great example of the guy who went on Q&A, the guy who challenged Kelly O'Dwyer and then ended up on the front page of the Herald Sun and the Oz every day. I think that Q&A need to take some responsibility for that as well. They need to remember that, like, they're putting someone. I think that Q&A need to remember that if they're putting someone up and they're putting their full name up, there's a responsibility there.
All right, on that note, let's open it up to the floor, shall we? So if we can just keep our questions brief where possible, because we want the answers to be longer than the questions. Any questions from the floor? Sir up the front, so just wait till the microphone's over to you, and we'll take a question and get an answer from the panel. Go ahead.
Hi, Mark, I'm one of those older journalists you're speaking about, which is a little bit depressing seeing as I'm 35.
No, don't be silly.
So there you go. But interesting to hear your thoughts coming back to Oz votes in the federal election. There's been some coverage, especially from Matthew Nott from Fairfax, about how the Canberra Press Gallery at large basically called the election wrong.
Yep.
Love to hear what you think about how that played out on social media. I mean, from your experience over those 8 weeks, did it seem that way?
Yeah, totally. So Matthew's a good friend. We were on the bus together. We played
squash together.
We played a lot of games of squash together. Matthew was right, and that was what was so funny. When he wrote this piece a couple of weeks ago, which basically said that the press gallery got it wrong, all the press gallery were like, no, we didn't. We got it totally right. And I was like, no. I was on a panel the day before the election with Michelle Grattan, Paul Kelly, Laura Tingle, and Fran Kelly, and it was like, you could not get four more thought leaders. And when they were asked to predict the election, all of them said 4, 5, 6 seats. And when the result came in, it was 1 seat. The Fairfax deserved credit. I think it was Mark Kenny, the day before the election, said that it's 50-50 and stood by it and was just like, well, it's 50-50, could go either way. The reason why the press gallery got fooled was a couple of things. Malcolm Turnbull went home at 1:30 every day, and it threw everyone. It threw me, it threw Matthew, it threw all the journalists. Were just like, what's he doing at 2 p.m? He's got a whole other 8 hours before he goes potentially to bed. Is he going fundraising? And so we'd ask the staffers, what's he doing? And he's like, oh, he's just spending time with his grandchild. And I'm like, all right. It is the biggest moment of his career. And it's so different to the way that Tony Abbott and Kevin Rudd used to act, which is energise the bunnies. I will just say this. There were some people in the press gallery that got it right. Don't get me wrong. 100% they did. But do not tell me for a second that the whole country didn't think that Malcolm Turnbull was coasting to a win. I think everyone thought it was going to be 5, 6 seats. And Malcolm Turnbull, that's why he was so angry on that night. It was the anger in his face was that he realised how he'd let it slip.
That and Medicare.
Oh, the text messages. Oh, the text messages.
What happened with that? Is that still being followed up?
No. It's done. The AFP were just stop being ridiculous.
Refer to the AFP.
Yeah.
I've talked about this before. Just a quick side note. There's a classic trope of journalism where if anything kind of scandalous happens, there will be a follow-up story that is, it's been referred to police, and that was a classic one. And usually all that means is someone has copied that text message, put it in an attachment, and then sent it to info@afp.gov.au.
And the headline becomes "Federal Police to investigate so-and-so." It's like, what? You just sent an email to the info line at the Federal Police. I can genuinely write a headline that's "Federal Police to investigate Tom Cowie," and I just literally just was like, "Hey AFP, check into Tom Cowie's Twitter account. It's dodgy."
Or tomwantsajob.com.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the floor? So we've got a few over there. We'll just start with the lady in the black. Yep.
Hi. A lot of people talk about how social media polarises public opinion. How should emerging journalism respond to that?
So you mean, should journalists sort of have their own opinions on Twitter or?
I suppose, how do you... you talked before about Pauline Hanson and how attacking Pauline Hanson or making fun of her will just harden her base. How do people report in that context?
Okay. I think it's all about sort of still applying the classic rules of journalism, which is research, fact-checking. If you can sort of stand up a story that shoots down one of... Pauline Hanson said today, we're being swamped by Muslims. She said before, we're being swamped by Asians.
And there are Asian Muslims. Like, there are both. They could be both.
So, I mean, you could easily just come out and say, write a one-word story wrong in response to that. But like you said, that's probably going to harden people's opinions. So if you can, show and prove that she's completely false and that it's not happening that way, then maybe you can shift it. But I think some people are just set in their ways and really you can't change their mind.
Totally. I always go back to my sister. She, her homepage is Mamma Mia. And it's like, it hurts me that my sister reads Mamma Mia. And I love Mamma Mia, but and MSN is, she loves going to MSN. I don't get it. But Sarah, my sister, she doesn't go on Twitter. She only goes on Instagram and on Facebook. She gets her news from non-polarised sources. So when you ask her, are you angry about Malcolm Turnbull? She's like, no, Malcolm Turnbull's great. And she's just like, Malcolm Turnbull's fine, blah, 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 blah. But if you go onto the sewer that is Twitter, there are all these people just ranting and raving about how awful Malcolm Turnbull is. But my sister would never, ever get any of that information. All she gets is pretty standard stories about news stories. So I think that, I saw over the course of months, centre-left people turn Malcolm Turnbull into this awful person on Twitter and on social media, which is just not true. He didn't change that much, which might be the problem. But it's I think that sometimes you're being asked every 5 seconds for your opinion on Twitter and on platforms. It's Twitter's give us your immediate opinion that's uninformed. We want to, broadcast it and promote it and all this sort of stuff. I think that you just need to be careful, because if you do that, you're going to end up as a partisan, and you don't want to do that. The best thing that can ever happen, you want to turn into someone like David Spears, because who knows who David Spears is voting for? I don't know. The guy turns everyone to mush, and I think that that's the goal of myself. I want to take shots at all sides, but not partisan shots. I love how Labor come out and be we're so pure on marriage equality. It's you were in government 2007 to 2013, so if you can, as a young journalist, you should be really careful to not come off as a partisan if you want to be a political reporter.
Tom, you want to quickly add to that, or?
Oh, just adding to that, Darren Hinch thinks that journalists shouldn't vote, so maybe
which is crap. Which is bullshit. Do you know, this is... Okay, Darren, should the public service vote? Because public servants are supposed to be... should the Governor-General not vote? The Governor-General should, recuse himself because, he has the power to... Because if he has a... It's be mature. We can vote.
Speaking of mature, we had another question from the floor. We might take you, and it might be the last one, because there is wine outside, which is the most pressing thing in my life at the moment. So short question, short answer from our panel, please.
Okay. Hello, Mark. My question was for you. On the way here, I was listening to the podcast of last year, the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, Next Year's News Now, and you were talking about how you felt that BuzzFeed had a lot of freedom to sort of establish new beats that sort of old legacy media don't have, for example, an LGBTQI beat. I was just wondering, what sort of content would you like to see BuzzFeed doing that you're not doing now? And alternatively, what are you doing now that you'd like to see BuzzFeed stop doing?
So I'm glad you asked that. One of the great things at BuzzFeed is that we're not governed by having to set up a public service reporter, a transport reporter, or whatever, because they're just not the stories that go well online for us. The Age, I reckon The Age probably does great transport stories that probably do really well, but for Victoria, right? So in the age of the internet, in the age of Facebook, what does really well is LGBT. We've got an amazing LGBT reporter, Lane Sainty, and our Indigenous Affairs reporter, Alan Clark, we poached from the ABC, and he was nominated for a Walkley last year. So we look across and we say, okay, so what if we just and I promise you it's not because I'm sitting next to you, I've been lobbying for a domestic violence reporter for a while for my boss, because I'm like, imagine if you just had a young reporter aggressively going out, getting stories, original scoops about the responses to domestic violence, and there's about stories about DV that are in the public interest that expose some of the crap that's going on out there. We would immediately create even media buzz if we employed someone who just focused on that.
I would jump in there and say that there are a couple of people that do that well for other outlets, so highly encourage that.
Yeah, and it's sort of like, we were thinking about a gender reporter, like someone who would just focus on gender issues, who would focus on feminism and that sort of stuff.
I think you've got the perfect candidate sitting right next to you, mate. We should talk over wine. Jess, do you want to move back to Sydney? Or?
No, but I mean this, it's like, but just think about if you just could you had a clean slate. We don't want more political reporters because everyone's doing politics. But if you actually have someone who's doing, we just look at our stories that do really well. It's like stories around gender, around LGBT. It's bizarrely, it's Black Aboriginal Twitter is a huge thing. They share every one of Alan Clark's stories. They are engaged. Whenever Lane writes a story, it is shared crazily amongst LGBT Twitter. Think about the streams of communities that are out there that are crying out for some journalism and their stories to be told.
We will continue the conversation outside with a drink in our hands, I think. But please thank Tom Cowie, Jess Gregory and Mark Di Stefano. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for them. I've been Erdem Koc. Before I hand back over to Suzanne, we are selling Mark's book outside, What a Time to Be Alive, which is a great read. I've spent the last 3 days reading it. So if you're a nerd and if you really want to understand the back workings of how the election campaign took place, please buy it. And Mark's happy to sign a few copies, depends, outside as well. So thanks, guys. Suzanne?